I'm happy to respond to any questions that you have. I may have to leave a bit earlier because, as you know, the former Secretary General of the UN, a wonderful man, Kofi Annan, may be celebrating his birthday in a short while, so I may have to go for his birthday party after I sign a few books, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes, please.
Yes, you said earlier that
Is that, I think there's a microphone, right? Yeah. I'm doing this because the light over there is quite sharp. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, yes.
Yes. You said earlier that the reasons for the vast improvement in the human condition, that the reasons are complex and manifold. I would suggest that one of the key reasons has been the expansion of individual freedoms, political and economic.
Yeah.
Now, if you take examples such as climate change that may be a threatening issue globally, I wonder what your view is about the different ways in which that can be addressed. Specifically, there are many proposals that would intrude on individual freedoms, whereas some other proposals, such as a simple tax on carbon, might not. So I'm concerned, and I'd like your view of the issue. I mean, you said at the end that we have made great progress without a global plan. And I wonder about your concern, if any, that developing plans might lead to a net decrease in individual freedom and therefore to a net decrease in human well-being.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other piece of good news, of course, is that, you see, when Americans speak of freedoms, the first thing they think about is political freedom. And I suppose it's a fair point, you see, that's also important. But there are also, for many other societies, from where they come from, simple personal freedoms matter a lot, you know. I mean, like you take a case of China, right? 1.2 billion, now 1.3, 1.4 billion people. For many decades, the Chinese people could not decide what to study, what to read, where to travel. They were not allowed to leave. Forget leaving China. They were not allowed to leave their own provinces, right? And they could not choose what to wear. They could not choose what to buy. Now, from that condition, right, the Chinese people today can travel. And by the way, you know, each year, everyone says that China is a closed society. Each year nowadays, 70 million and soon 100 million Chinese, 100 million Chinese leave China freely. And you know what? Guess what? They come back freely. Now, clearly there's been a remarkable expansion of personal freedom that enables them to travel overseas and come back to China. So, yes, the Chinese do not enjoy the kind of political freedoms that the Americans enjoy or the people in the West enjoy, but the amount of personal freedom that they have has changed dramatically. And when I speak of a global plan, I don't speak of a global plan that is superimposed on you by an external authority. It's one that is developed by consensus among everybody on a voluntary basis. And I say, for example, you know, we managed to achieve, after 20 years of negotiations, something called the Law of the Sea Treaty, which, by the way, sadly, probably the only major country that hasn't ratified is the United States of America. Since the seas cover 77% of the Earth's surface, surely we can have a Law of Planet Earth Treaty that covers the remaining 23% of the Earth's surface. And it can be done. Of course, the negotiations are difficult, they're painful, they may take a decade or two, but we can reach an agreement. But to reach that agreement, there's one word that, of course, no leader can use, especially in the West, is the word sacrifice. And we all have to sacrifice something. And clearly, the richer countries will have to sacrifice more than the poorer countries. And here, the paradox is that actually, it is precisely because you have so much political freedom in America, and because, you know, the politicians are always, in a sense, responding to populist pressures all the time, they dare not tell hard truths to their population and tell them, hey, if you really want to create a better world for your children and grandchildren, start making a few small sacrifices now. The day when an elected politician can do that in America, then I think a new day has begun. Yes, please. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for your remarks. They've been very hopeful, and I think that's sometimes appreciated in these sometimes dark times. But you cannot ignore that fear that results from change is also pretty rampant in the world. We've seen an uptick in non-state players. We've seen an uptick in cultural balkanization around the world. We've seen an uptick in terms of regional divisiveness, even in this country, politically. So how do you suggest that this, global planet, amidst this change that I think the developing world is feeling, we see that, England had to postpone, reconfirming its connection to the EU. You talk about, the decline of interstate conflicts, but we see a splintering, whether it's based on nationalism, whether we see it based on political ideology or religious ideology. It's like, so explain how you reconcile that sort of, movement based on fear against the message of hope, I think, that runs throughout your remarks.
Yeah, you see, what's one of the most dramatic reversals of our human condition today is that for a long time, especially after World War II, through the 50s and 60s and the 70s and maybe even the 80s, you felt that you had to live in the developed world, especially in Europe or America, to feel this sense of hope about the future. And when I grew up in Singapore, Singapore was supposed to have become a failed state. And, I grew up in a third world state in Singapore where we didn't have a flush toilet in the house. I was put on a special feeding program because I was underweight. There were ethnic riots on my doorstep. And, so I lived in that world. I grew up in that world. And it's sort of very strange now, and in this world of today, if you want to see hope, you don't go to Europe. It's amazing how pessimistic Europe is, And even in America, which has always been the most optimistic country in the world, is becoming quite frightened of the future. But I can tell you that in the rest of the world, and in Asia, for example, the amount of optimism about the future has grown by leaps and bounds. Even Africa, The Economist came out with a cover story about Africa rising, pointing out that 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world over the past decade were African. And then in Latin America too, you see the signs of change and movement. So if you remember that only 12% of the world's population lives in the West and 88% lives outside the West, from the point of view of the 88% who live outside the West, for most of them, the last 20, 30 years have been the best they've enjoyed in 300 years. So that sense of hope is there, out there. And again, by the way, I should warn you, in case you're all frightened of good news, that if you read my book, you might actually drown in good news. So, so prepare yourself, maybe take an aspirin or something before you read it, because you'll be amazed at the amount of good news there is in the rest of the world. And of course, there are continuing problems. All the problems you mentioned are real and are there. But the trend lines, if you look at it objectively, empirically, at all the statistics, it is very clear in sphere after sphere, for most of humanity, the condition has improved dramatically in the last 20 years. Please, yes.
You, of course, were an ambassador to the UN, and you've mentioned the UN several times in your remarks. How much difference, when you talk about the last 30 years of peace, did the UN make in that transition? In other words, if we'd never had a United Nations, how peaceful would the world have been today?
Well, when most people look at the UN, they tend to focus on the UN Secretariat and its performance and so on and so forth. And of course, the UN Secretariat's performance has been mixed. But, the UN also has something called the UN Charter. And, for most of human history, incidentally, if you lived in a small state, especially a small state like Singapore, the chances of being invaded and occupied by a larger neighbor was quite high, like what Hitler did with the Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. That was the normal human condition. But one dramatic thing that changed in 1945 with the adoption of the UN Charter is that it completely delegitimized that. Now, it didn't mean, after that, yes, you continued to have, from time to time, invasions of small countries, but each time it happened, the global public opinion condemned it so strongly that even the Soviet Union had to withdraw from Afghanistan. Vietnam had to withdraw from Cambodia. And as you know, even the United States, which was spending more on defense than the rest of the world combined, found it very difficult to occupy a small state like Iraq and had to leave also. So the grain of human history was changed by the UN Charter. And so I think if we can remember that, then we should remember why we should work harder to make the UN even stronger in the years to come. Because I actually think, and I know I may remain one of the last few believers in the UN in the world, I actually think that if you strengthen that organization and make it work better, we will actually have a better world.